He thought he moved to the woods to escape life. But the day he saw a lone dog watching him through the winter trees, he knew someone or something had found him first. From that silent stare, a bond was born. And when danger struck without warning, loyalty ran toward the fire before fear could catch up. They didn't just save a life that night. They saved a man who no longer believed his heart could feel anything at all. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. A winter morning in Spokane, Washington. The snow has stopped, but cold lingers like held breath in the pines. David Walker woke before dawn, as if some instinct older than language still dragged him from sleep. He no longer heard helicopter rotors or shouted commands, yet silence had a weight of its own, sometimes heavier than war. He sat in his kitchen holding a mug of coffee, feeling its heat press into his palms the way memories press into ribs. Outside, the world was pale and unmoving, and the snow that covered it had settled into a hardened crust, like thoughts that refused to melt. He had come to Spokane for quiet, thinking it would soften the noise inside his head. Instead, quiet became a mirror, and mirrors rarely lie. He stepped onto the porch, breath rising into the cold air like small ghosts that vanished before becoming whole. For a brief moment, he let himself believe the morning was gentle, but gentleness unnerved him more than storms ever had. He scanned the tree line, behind the cabin, not because he expected danger, but because habit demanded it. When you have lived long enough with uncertainty, vigilance becomes a muscle that refuses to relax. He whispered into the air, half joke, half truth, "Another day in paradise." No one answered. Silence rarely bothers with sarcasm. A faint crunch of snow interrupted his thoughts. It wasn't the sudden breaking of a branch or the frantic movement of prey. It was deliberate, steady, as if something or someone took measured steps toward him. He straightened, shoulders tightening without conscious effort. The sound came again, then stopped. He took a slow breath, feeling his pulse settle into that familiar, controlled rhythm. His voice cut through the cold. "Who's there?" The trees gave nothing back. Then he saw it, a figure between the pines, still, watching. The posture was unmistakable, alert, grounded, evaluating. A German shepherd, not a puppy, not elderly, but seasoned. Its gaze held steady. Not frightened, not pleading, but searching in a way that made David feel exposed. The dog neither barked nor ran. It simply stood as though silence belonged to it, not him. For a moment he wondered if the animal saw straight through the armor he pretended not to wear. He felt something shift in his chest, reluctant recognition. Companionship had been foreign for so long that he barely remembered what it felt like to be regarded without suspicion or pity. The dog's presence brought back memories of missions where teammates didn't need to speak to communicate. Breath, posture, tension, those were languages fluent among soldiers. Now that familiarity returned unexpectedly in the steady gaze of an animal. He took a step closer, careful not to appear threatening. The dog held its ground. "You lost?" he asked quietly, though he knew the word carried different meaning depending on species. The dog didn't move, didn't flinch, only tilted its head slightly as if judging whether he earned its trust. David felt that scrutiny like a searchlight. Most people looked at him with guarded curiosity, unsure how close to stand near a man who had known violence too well. But this animal saw him without hesitation or fear, and that frightened him more than judgment ever had. He extended a hand, not to touch, just enough to show intention. The dog neither advanced nor retreated. Trust, he thought, is often nothing more than the decision not to walk away. David lowered his hand and stepped back inside, leaving the door open a moment longer than necessary. That tiny hesitation irritated him. Hope was something he tried not to feed. He washed dishes that were already clean, tightened screws that didn't need tightening, and swept the porch. The wind would undo the work. Movement kept his thoughts from collapsing inward. When he returned to the window, the dog had shifted position, now lying near the bottom step of the porch as if keeping vigil. David felt the first tug of something he did not want to name. He went outside again, arms crossed to hide the tension in his hands. "You planning to stay?" he muttered. The dog didn't reply, of course, but its eyes held conviction. Conviction was something David once trusted more than his own heartbeat. Daylight crept slowly across the yard. David chopped wood until sweat warmed his neck despite the cold. The repetition of force and breath steadied him in ways conversation never could. Yet the dog remained, silent but undeniable. By afternoon, David found himself carrying out a bowl of water. He placed it on the porch, speaking aloud, though he wasn't sure whose benefit it served. Just water, nothing else. The dog drank without haste, movements deliberate, as if dignity mattered even in need. When finished, it sat again, not close enough to be familiar, not distant enough to be dismissal. The sun sank behind the trees, turning the snow faintly blue. David lingered on the porch, mug cooling, between his hands. He wanted to tell himself he didn't care whether the dog stayed through the night, but the lie felt unnecessary. There was no one to hear it but him. He went to bed expecting the dreams that sometimes tore him awake, but instead found unexpected calm. Perhaps the mind rests differently when it senses another presence nearby. Before dawn, he woke and opened the door to cold that felt sharper than the day before. The dog was still there, resting but alert, as though guarding something fragile within the cabin. David stared at it for a long moment, then sighed. The kind of sigh that belongs to someone who knows the world is changing whether he consents or not. He whispered into the morning air, "You're persistent. I'll give you that." The dog responded only with steady eyes that held no judgment, only patience. For the first time in months, David didn't feel entirely alone. He wasn't sure whether that comforted him or terrified him. But as frost clung to the cabin roof and breath fogged the air between man and dog, a new thread, a thin, reluctant one, wove itself into the fabric of his days. Silence hadn't disappeared, but it no longer felt empty. The dog stayed, and David didn't tell it to leave. Morning crept into Spokane with cold air sharp enough to wake even the most reluctant thoughts, and the snow in the yard had turned firm under another night of freezing wind, while faint sunlight tried and failed to warm anything it touched. David stepped outside before the cabin's warmth could pull him back in, surprised at how naturally his eyes drifted toward the porch steps, where Ranger still lay, as if silence itself had instructed him to guard the house. The sight stirred something David tried to push away, a familiarity he both welcomed and feared, because welcoming anything again meant risking loss. He muttered a greeting that was barely more than breath, and Ranger lifted his head with the quiet alertness of someone who understood the weight hidden in routine. They regarded each other without rush. Trust was not born overnight, but something about the dog's steady presence felt like the kind of patience David once needed from others, yet rarely asked for. He walked towards the woodpile, splitting logs with a rhythm that steadied him when thoughts became too loud, and Ranger followed with slow, measured steps, as if sensing that distance between them had to shrink gently. While he worked, David remembered mornings overseas when the sound of tools or machinery offered brief sanctuaries from thoughts he did not dare speak aloud, and something about Ranger's silent company startled him with how similar the feeling was: comfort without demand, understanding without intrusion. Later, when David returned to the porch to sweep away the thin layer of frost, Ranger nudged the broom with his snout, not playfully, but with a firm insistence that felt like a wordless check-in. "Are you present or drifting again?" David exhaled sharply, annoyed at being seen through so easily, yet relieved at the same time because few things in his life had recently challenged him to remain rooted in the moment. He noticed the water bowl was half frozen, so he swapped it with warm water from the kitchen, trying not to think too much about why he bothered, though the answer hovered under every thought. Caring was easier when the other side didn't judge you for failing sometimes. He caught himself wondering if Ranger belonged to someone nearby, but the dog's constant watchfulness suggested a history David couldn't guess, a past heavy enough to grant him the discipline to stay without chains or commands. David recognized that kind of history. He lived with traces of it every time he closed his eyes. As the afternoon passed, he walked to the edge of the property to fix the old fence, which leaned heavily after winter winds, and Ranger followed him again, not close enough to interfere, but never too far, scanning the surroundings with that instinctive awareness that once governed survival. David remembered nights spent watching perimeters with men who came and went like flickering lights, and he wondered if Ranger had ever guarded anything that mattered and lost it, if that was why the dog stayed, seeking something familiar that didn't vanish. The thought unsettled him because it felt too close to his own truth. He took a break, leaning against the cold timber, and tried to stretch the stiffness from his shoulder where an old injury never fully healed. Ranger observed him with the calm presence of someone who had seen pain before, and David felt exposed, as if the dog reminded him that strength had nothing to do with pretending wounds didn't linger. A soft crunch of snow drew their attention. A figure approached from the path leading to the nearby road, bundled against the cold, carrying a paper bag. David tensed instinctively before recognizing her as the neighbor mentioned when he first moved in, Mrs. Miller, a widow who lived alone with an aging horse she rarely rode anymore. She offered a reserved greeting and handed him the bag, explaining she baked too much bread and feared it would go stale if she kept it. Her tone was casual, but her eyes lingered a moment too long on Ranger, as if she recognized something in the dog's posture, some sign of past loyalty or loss, though she did not comment. David accepted the bread with a nod, unsure what to do with the warmth of the gesture. As she turned to leave, she paused and said she had seen Ranger once before near the tree line weeks ago, standing as if waiting for someone who never returned, then left without further explanation. David froze at the thought, the idea that Ranger's patience might come from abandonment rather than choice. And when he looked at the dog, he saw something unreadable in those steady eyes. Not sadness exactly, but endurance, the kind found in those who survive by holding on longer than anyone expects. After Mrs. Miller disappeared beyond the path, David returned inside with Ranger, following him to the door before stopping, waiting for permission that was never explicitly given. David hesitated only a second before opening the Dr. Wider, and Ranger entered with the cautious acceptance of someone who understood how easily welcome could vanish. The cabin's warmth wrapped around them, and David felt the walls that once seemed like a fortress now soften into something closer to shelter. He placed the bread on the counter and sat awkwardly on the edge of the couch, as if unused to sharing space with another living being, while Ranger settled near the door, still close enough to watch him without pressure. For a long time neither moved, and in that stillness David realized silence felt different now, less like isolation and more like a beginning he didn't yet know how to name. When night finally rose, the wind rattled the windows with a force that once would have kept him awake, but this time he found himself listening for Ranger's steady breathing instead of echoes from years gone by. And just as sleep began to pull him under, a sharp, distant howl cut through the quiet from somewhere deep in the forest, Awichakur sound that made Ranger lift his head and hold utterly still, as if he recognized a voice from a past not yet finished. The wind eased by morning, leaving Spokane wrapped in a brittle stillness that seemed to listen for something beneath the surface of the snow, and the forest behind David's cabin held a tension he could not name yet felt with every breath. David stepped outside with a stiffness that came from both cold and memory, and his eyes immediately searched for Ranger without thinking, finding the dog standing near the edge of the yard as if defending a border invisible to anyone else. There was no reason for unease, yet both man and dog moved with the quiet vigilance of those who knew peace was never guaranteed. David tried to push away the echo of last night's distant howl, but it lingered like a question that refused an answer. Ranger paced once in a slow circle before settling near the porch, gaze fixed toward the tree line, not tense but alert, like someone waiting for a message long overdue. David felt a tug of discomfort, realizing he had begun to look to Ranger for cues about how safe he should feel. He had promised himself never to rely on anything again after leaving the service because relying meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain. Yet here he was letting a dog dictate the shape of his mornings. He walked toward the woodpile again, even though there was no urgency, using the axe the way he once used training, a method to occupy a mind too prone to wandering. Each strike sent a clean sound through the cold air, and with every swing he felt his thoughts settling just enough to breathe. Ranger watched with a focus that was not curiosity, but recognition, as if the rhythm of work told him something about the man he had chosen to stay beside. When David paused to stretch his shoulder, the old injury flared with a brief sharpness that made him curse under his breath. Ranger shifted his weight forward, ears twitching as if sensing the momentary fracture in David's composure. But the dog did not move closer. That restraint struck David harder than pity ever could, because pity isolates, while understanding stands nearby without trying to fix what cannot be undone. He sat on the porch step to catch his breath, fingers gripping his knees, and Ranger approached slowly, stopping just close enough that David could feel the warmth of presence without touch. The dog lowered his head slightly, not submissive, but observant, and David felt seen in a way that both comforted and unsettled him. He wondered again what Ranger had endured to become this steady, this patient, this unwilling to look away. The old fear returned, the fear that things which stayed could also leave, that loyalty did not guarantee permanence. David closed his eyes for a moment and found memories rising uninvited. The last mission, the weight of expectations, the look on a teammate's face before the blast that changed everything. He forced his eyes open and swallowed hard, as if the cold air could freeze the memories before they fully formed. Ranger remained still, breathing steadily, and David let the silence linger, because silence with Ranger did not feel like isolation anymore. A soft crunch of snow made him turn. This time it was only Mrs. Miller approaching, with measured steps, carrying a small envelope in one hand. Her voice cut the quiet without breaking it, greeting David briefly before handing him the envelope and saying someone in town had left a message for him through her mailbox, thinking he might not have one set up yet. David felt a flicker of embarrassment at being reminded how little connection he kept with the world outside the cabin, but he thanked her quietly. Ranger watched her without hostility, yet there was a flicker in his posture, a slight shift that made David think the dog recognized something in her scent or voice. Perhaps because she had tended to many animals over the years and carried traces of them with her. Mrs. Miller mentioned she had heard the distant howl last night too, then hesitated as if deciding whether to say more. But she stopped herself and instead asked if David needed help repairing the leaning section of his fence before winter storms grew heavier. He refused politely, unsure whether he feared accepting help or feared how easily he might grow used to it. When she left, Ranger sat again near the porch with that same unwavering attention toward the forest. David held the envelope without opening it, feeling the weight of it, like a pull toward a world he had chosen to leave behind. The idea that someone wanted to reach him made his stomach tighten with unease, and memories of notifications, orders, warnings, and condolences flooded past his defenses before he could stop them. He placed the letter on the kitchen counter without reading it, telling himself he would open it later, then found reasons to avoid doing so as the hours passed. He fixed the hinge of the shed door, cleared the path to the well, rearranged tools that did not need rearranging, all while Ranger stayed near, watchful without interference. Late afternoon light stretched shadows long across the yard, and David finally opened the envelope after circling around it all day like a trap. The letter was from a former teammate, written in careful words that tried to be respectful, yet carried the undercurrent of worry. It said nothing specific, only asked how David was holding up, mentioned hearing he moved north, and offered a phone number to call if he ever wanted to talk or needed anything. The letter felt heavier than its single sheet of paper should allow. David folded it back up slowly, fingers trembling despite the cold not being responsible. The silence in the cabin thickened, pressing against him with memory and expectation. Ranger watched from the doorway, eyes steady, sensing the shift without needing explanation. David wanted to throw the letter away but couldn't. He wanted to call but couldn't. He wanted to believe he was fine alone, yet the letter whispered a truth he did not want. To face that letting people vanish from his life did not keep him safe, only solitary. He took the letter back outside and sat on the porch step again, letting Ranger sit beside him in shared silence. The forest was calm, but something in the air felt like before a storm, though no clouds gathered overhead. David wondered if the howl from the previous night and the letter arriving today were coincidences or signs pulling him toward something he wasn't ready to confront. As dusk fell, Ranger suddenly lifted his head, gaze fixed toward the path where Mrs. Miller had walked earlier, body still but intent unmistakable, and David felt the same tightening in his chest that came before events that never turned out simple. He stood slowly, feeling the cold settle into his bones, and whispered to Ranger, without meaning to, asking what he sensed out there. Ranger did not move, did not make a sound, but his unwavering stare told David one truth clearly. Whatever waited beyond the trees was no longer part of the past, and this time it would not stay silent. The morning sky over Spokane was quiet in a way that made David unsure whether the world was waking up or simply holding its breath, and the forest behind the cabin stood motionless beneath a pale light that hinted at snow yet to fall. David walked outside with the letter still in his pocket, folded so precisely that it felt like a stone, not paper. Ranger stayed close to the porch, watching him with the attentive calm of someone waiting to see which direction a difficult choice might tilt. David ignored the path that led toward town, even though his eyes drifted to it instinctively, as if drawn by the weight of an unfinished conversation he had not started. He tried instead to focus on clearing ice from the steps, but the repetition failed to quiet his mind. The letter and the distant howl had tangled together overnight, and he hated how easily old memories resurfaced when silence stopped protecting him. Ranger paced once in a slow arc around the yard before sitting near the edge, shoulders tense with the poised patience of someone sensing a storm that humans could not hear yet. David knew that posture from his own past, the readiness to move without a second thought when instinct whispered it was time. He rubbed his temples and forced himself to breathe slower, recognizing the subtle pull toward avoidance. He had promised himself he would not return to town for anything unnecessary, convinced distance would help him heal. But the longer he ignored the letter, the more childish his stubbornness felt. Avoidance was a familiar armor, but armor grows heavy over time. As midday approached, David finally decided to walk to the general store for supplies he did not truly need, telling himself Ranger deserved better food than leftovers. He knew it was an excuse, but it was one he could live with. Ranger followed without being asked, his presence neither clingy nor distant, simply aligned with David's steps as though shadow and body belonged together. The road into town was partially cleared, gravel visible beneath the frozen crust, and with each step, David felt the tension in his chest shift between dread and acceptance. Ranger occasionally paused to glance toward the tree line, but never lagged behind, carrying an air of silent guardianship that reminded David how strange it felt to be watched over again. When they reached the town's small park, David slowed involuntarily. The memorial stood at its center, a modest stone marker bearing names he had never spoken aloud yet recognized in spirit. Ranger stopped beside him without prompting, head lowered slightly, as if acknowledging something beyond sight. David felt his breath catch, knowing he could walk past without anyone questioning him, but Ranger's presence made avoidance feel wrong. He approached the memorial with a stiffness, born not from cold, but from the struggle to maintain composure. The wind cut across the open field, but David barely noticed as he reached out and brushed snow from the plaque. His hand lingered longer than intended, and Ranger sat close enough that David could feel the quiet steadiness of his breath. Without warning, footsteps approached, slow and uncertain. David turned and recognized a face he had only seen once during his move to Spokane. Thomas Green, a retired Army officer who volunteered at the local Veterans Center. He greeted David with a voice that carried both warmth and caution, and though David disliked small talk, he answered because silence here felt disrespectful. Thomas mentioned that gatherings at the memorial were rare in winter but not unheard of, then hesitated before asking gently how David was settling in. David offered a short response, hoping brevity would close the subject, but Thomas's gaze flicked to Ranger, and something in it softened. He said he had seen Ranger near town weeks earlier, waiting outside the hardware store for hours, as if expecting someone who never arrived. David felt a twist of unease, realizing Mrs. Miller had implied something similar, and now the pattern had become undeniable. Ranger's posture remained calm, but David saw a flicker of recognition, as if the dog heard a memory rather than words. Thomas did not linger after that. He offered his number and a quiet reminder that isolation was not strength when carried too long. David nodded without committing to anything, and Thomas walked away, leaving the memorial to wind and silence once more. David let the quiet settle before whispering something he had not intended to speak aloud, asking Ranger who he had been waiting for. Ranger did not move, but his steady gaze held a depth that made David wish he could translate loyalty into language. They continued toward the general store, and inside, David exchanged brief greetings with the shopkeeper, who offered dog treats without being asked. David declined at first, then accepted, unsure whether the gesture embarrassed or comforted him. He noticed a bulletin board near the entrance. Most flyers faded or outdated, but one caught his eye. A notice seeking information about a missing German Shepherd from months ago, posted by a family whose contact number was now crossed out. A faint crease formed between David's brows as he took in the detail, and Ranger lifted his head slightly, as if sensing the shift in his attention. David walked away from the board without touching it, but the image echoed in his mind even after leaving the store. On the walk back, he felt the distance between him and Ranger narrow further, not physically but emotionally, as if each shared silence added another layer of trust, neither acknowledged aloud. When they reached the cabin, the air felt different, heavier somehow. David placed the supplies inside, then sat on the porch step while Ranger settled near him. Together they watched the tree line, both sensing something rising beneath the surface of their quiet routine. David reached into his pocket and felt the folded letter. Again, and this time he did not put it away. He opened it slowly, reading every word twice, and felt the familiar pull of a past he had tried to outrun. Ranger shifted closer, gaze fixed on the woods, as if listening for something only he could hear. The wind died suddenly, leaving the air suspended in unnatural stillness, and David felt an unexpected chill crawl along his spine. He stood slowly, unsure whether he moved because he heard something or because Ranger did. Then Ranger lifted his head sharply, posture focused, as if someone had crossed an unseen threshold in the forest beyond, and David felt the same instinct ignite in his chest, a certainty that whatever waited there had begun to move toward them. The day began colder than it should have, with a gray sky that felt too heavy for Spokane's late winter, and David sensed something restless beneath the surface of the quiet, as if the forest had swallowed all sound to prepare for something it could not name. Ranger stood near the tree line again, posture focused, eyes steady, as though he had tracked invisible movement throughout the night. David watched him while tightening the last board of the repaired fence, annoyed at how easily he now looked to the dog for confirmation that the world was still intact. He told himself he was merely observing, not depending, but the distinction felt thinner every day. When the wind shifted, carrying a faint scent David could not identify, Ranger lifted his head sharply and inhaled with the precision of someone recognizing more than air. David frowned, remembering how Ranger had reacted the previous evening, the same tension in muscles, the same searching gaze. He tried to dismiss it as animal, instinct reacting to distant wildlife, yet a tremor passed through his thoughts that refused to settle. He walked back toward the cabin, calling Ranger without raising his voice, and the dog followed closely, but with his attention fixed toward the forest as if expecting someone to emerge. David pretended not to notice how his own pulse reacted to the dog's alertness. Inside, he boiled water for coffee while glancing repeatedly at the letter lying on the table. He had read it again earlier that morning, and each time the words from his former teammate felt heavier. The mention of upcoming gatherings at memorials across the state had triggered something in him, a pull he resisted because he feared how those memories would reshape him if he let them in. He had come here to avoid mirrors, yet life kept handing him reflections he didn't ask for. The kettle whistled, and Ranger flinched slightly before resuming his watch, as if every sharp sound now demanded interpretation. David poured the coffee, ignoring how his hand trembled just enough for him to notice, and sat by the window watching thin branches sway without grace. The silence between him and Ranger grew taut, not hostile, but anticipatory, the way silence once felt before missions where uncertainty outweighed intelligence. He hated how familiar that felt. A sudden knock broke the tension. David's chest tightened before reason intervened, and he opened the door to find Mrs. Miller standing with a wool hat pulled tight, her voice quicker than usual as she explained that she had seen smoke rising behind the Ramirez property. She could not tell how serious it was, but her tone left no space for doubt that something urgent was happening. David barely remembered grabbing his coat. Ranger was already at the path's edge before David shut the door, as though the dog had understood every word. They moved quickly across the frozen ground, feet striking with purpose, breath condensing in frantic rhythm. David felt his training snap into place like an old harness, his awareness narrowing, his thoughts sharpening. Ranger stayed ahead, not running wild but guiding with firm intentionality, glancing back only once to confirm. David followed without hesitation. When they reached the hill overlooking the Ramirez property, David saw the smoke rising in thick twisting lines from behind the barn, darker than chimney smoke, and too erratic to be controlled burning. The sight jolted him with memory, heat, chaos, instinct. He swallowed hard, reminding himself this was not war, yet his heartbeat refused the distinction. They descended the hill quickly, the snow thinning into patches of muddy grass that pulled at David's boots. Ranger slowed only when they reached the yard, ears flickering with awareness, body angled toward the barn's side entrance. David saw no movement around the house and felt a surge of dread when he realized the Ramirez family's truck was nowhere in sight, but children's toys were. Scattered near the porch, half buried in snow, something twisted inside his chest at the thought of absence where presence belonged. He shouted toward the house but received no answer, and Ranger responded instantly, barking once with such clarity that it felt like a command. David sprinted toward the barn, the heat hitting before he reached the doorway. Smoke snaked from gaping cracks in the wooden walls, and through the haze he saw a small figure pinned against fallen boards near the rear wall. A toddler, barely able to stand, sat crying with eyes squeezed shut, hands reaching toward nothing. David dropped to his knees, instincts overriding everything else, calculating the safest path through the debris. Ranger barked again, not in panic but in urgent communication, stepping ahead just enough to lead David through a narrow space where the heat felt less punishing. David crawled between fallen beams, shielding the child with his body as he pulled her free, her sobs muffled against his coat. Ranger pressed close, watching for falling debris, reacting to shifts David could not notice through the smoke. David clutched the child and pushed forward, but a sudden crack above made him freeze. Ranger moved first, positioning himself between David and the danger, muscles poised not in fear but in fierce determination. David understood instantly. Ranger was not waiting to be told what loyalty required. He adjusted his position and moved faster, dodging the falling timber by inches. When they finally burst into the cold air, David placed the child gently onto a blanket of snow, rubbing her back until her sobs softened. Ranger circled once, wary and alert, gaze fixed toward the woods again, as if expecting the source of this calamity to step forward. When the sirens finally wailed faintly in the distance, carried by wind from town, David felt his knees weaken with delayed adrenaline. He sat in the snow, forehead pressed to his glove, breath shaking. Ranger approached slowly and placed his head near David's shoulder, not touching, simply existing beside him with a patience that restored something raw inside. David looked toward the barn, flames still licking the walls, and remembered how fire never asked who it took or what it scarred. He held the child tighter until firefighters rushed forward to take her, thanking him, asking questions, demanding details. He answered mechanically, but his mind drifted toward Ranger, who was staring once again toward the tree line with unwavering focus. And for the first time since arriving in Spokane, David felt the unmistakable sensation that something beyond their sight was beginning to close in, not a memory from his past, but a force moving toward his present. The wind shifted again, bringing with it a faint echo that might have been the distant howl from nights earlier, or maybe something else entirely, and Ranger's body tensed, as though he recognized a sound David could not hear. The air around Spokane never truly cleared after the fire, and even though the flames at the Ramirez property were finally extinguished, David woke the next morning with the unsettling feeling that something essential had been burned away inside him as well. Ranger lay near the wood stove where David had set up blankets, breathing heavier than usual, each inhale sounding like air scraped through memory rather than lungs. David knelt beside him, careful not to crowd, watching the slow rising and falling that seemed too deliberate to be comfortable. It was not panic that gripped him, but something deeper, the same sensation he once felt when watching over injured teammates, pretending calm while every hidden emotion pressed against restraint. He made coffee only to have it grow cold, untouched, because every time Ranger shifted his weight or released a shallow cough, David's attention snapped back to him. The dog was not helpless, but he was not whole either, and seeing that imbalance unmoored David more than he expected. He knew smoke inhalation could linger deceptively, tightening its grip unseen, and he hated how useless he felt without the tools or training to help. The cabin felt both too small and too large, closing in around him where he wanted space, and offering distance where he needed guidance. Outside, snow had frozen into uneven sheets, and the silence felt bruised rather than calm. He stepped onto the porch briefly to breathe air that did not taste of worry, but the cold wind hit his lungs like accusation. When he turned back toward the door, Ranger had dragged himself closer, not to follow, but to remain within sight, as if unwilling to let David confront anything alone. The loyalty was wordless, yet heavy, and David felt ashamed that he could not return it with equal certainty, not when fear blurred everything. As he brought Ranger warm water, he heard footsteps approaching through the snow. Mrs. Miller stood at the edge of the porch, bundled tightly, her expression carrying a seriousness that made David straighten instinctively. She asked if she could step inside, and when David gestured for her to enter, Ranger attempted to rise but settled again with visible effort. Mrs. Miller crouched near him without hesitation, her movements confident from years around animals, though she said nothing sentimental or dramatic. She examined Ranger's breathing, placing her hand near his muzzle, but not touching, gauging the rhythm in silence for several seconds before speaking softly to David. She explained that she had cared for dogs affected by smoke before, that she knew how to manage symptoms with humidity, warmth, and herbal steam, but her home had the equipment and space to do it properly. She said David's cabin was too dry for recovery and that Ranger would breathe easier in the back room of her house, where she used to keep nursing supplies for her late husband's service animals. The familiarity of her tone startled David more than the suggestion itself. He wanted to refuse instantly. The idea of letting Ranger leave his sight twisted something inside him. He tried to speak, but found the words did not form. Mrs. Miller seemed to read everything he failed to say, and she waited, not pushing, giving him the dignity of choice. David felt a surge of anger he could not define, an instinct to protect that clashed with the realization that protecting Ranger now meant accepting help he did not want. The shame of needing others scraped through him just as harshly as memories of failure. Ranger opened his eyes briefly, meeting David's gaze with tired steadiness, and something passed between them that did not require language, the understanding that stubbornness would not heal anything. David inhaled sharply, fighting the urge to retreat back into silence, then finally nodded once. Mrs. Miller did not smile or thank him for the decision. She simply began preparing, as if acknowledging that trust was fragile and did not need praise. Together they helped Ranger to his feet, David supporting with hands that trembled despite his effort to hide it. Ranger leaned into him with strength that flickered but did not disappear, and that faint resilience eased some of the panic gripping David's chest. The walk to Mrs. Miller's house felt longer than distance justified. Every step made David feel both stripped of control and strangely relieved. Mrs. Miller's home was warm in a way that did not suffocate, filled with practical comfort rather than decoration. And David noticed items belonging to her late husband arranged with care, medals tucked beside dog harnesses, and worn notebooks. She had created a space where memory and presence coexisted without conflict, something David had not yet learned to do. Ranger was guided to the back room, where a humidifier hummed quietly and blankets were laid neatly. When Ranger settled down, his breathing eased slightly, not healed but steadier, and David felt the tension in his shoulders loosen with equal subtlety. Mrs. Miller prepared herbal steam with practiced movements while speaking gently to Ranger, not babying him, but recognizing the gravity of his condition. David stood nearby, arms crossed too tightly, as if unsure whether to stay or leave. He felt the strange sensation of displacement, like watching a part of himself being tended to while he stood useless on the periphery. Mrs. Miller placed a hand lightly on his arm, a gesture of grounding rather than comfort, and told him he could visit any time but should get some rest. David wanted to say he would not leave Ranger's side, but exhaustion pulled at him, and he realized that if he collapsed, he would be of no use to anyone. He nodded again, grateful for the dignity of not being pushed further. As he stepped outside, the cold hit sharper than before, and for the first time since moving to Spokane, the cabin at the end of the path no longer felt protective but hollow, as though a Vital piece of his life was missing from its walls. He returned home with heavy steps, leaving the porch light on without understanding why. The silence inside felt different now, stretched and unfamiliar, like wearing an old uniform that no longer fit. He stared at the unmade blankets near the stove and felt a sudden grief for something that was not lost but simply absent. Night pressed against the windows, and fatigue finally dragged him toward sleep. But just as he drifted, a faint sound reached him from outside. Not a howl, not a cry, but something closer to footsteps passing through snow, steady and slow, as if someone had chosen this moment to walk the edge of his property without fear of being seen. Thin morning light filtered through Spokane's winter haze, and frost clung to roofs and fence posts as though the night had tried to hold the world still for one more hour of quiet. David returned from the cabin to Mrs. Miller's house with the same uncertain steps he had taken the evening before, but this time he felt clearer, as though sleep had stripped away everything except what mattered most. Ranger rested near the back-room heater, breathing steadier now, and the calm rhythm loosened the knot inside David's chest in a way words never could. He sat beside him silently, letting time move without interruption, aware that the dog's recovery was still fragile, yet undeniably progressing. Mrs. Miller entered briefly to bring warm herbal steam, her movements practical, and told David that Ranger had responded well during the night. She did not offer more reassurance than necessary, and that restraint felt like a kindness. David stayed with Ranger for several hours, talking, quietly, though not expecting any understanding beyond presence. He admitted to fears he had never spoken aloud, not even to those who once trusted him with their lives, fears about losing what he was finally learning to value. Ranger listened in stillness, occasionally lifting his head to acknowledge David's voice, not judging or soothing, simply bearing witness to words that David had buried long before leaving the service. As midday approached, David felt as though something inside him had shifted outside the boundaries of language. When Ranger slowly rose, breathing deeper than yesterday, David could not prevent a small exhale of relief that surprised him with its intensity. Ranger stepped toward the door with determination that lacked urgency but carried intention, and David understood without needing an explanation. They walked outside together, with Mrs. Miller observing only long enough to confirm that Ranger's breathing remained stable before nodding her approval. David thanked her quietly, promising to return if needed, and though she did not reply immediately, her eyes held a recognition that connection did not always require permanence to be meaningful. As David and Ranger made their way back toward the cabin, the silence between them felt fuller. No longer a weight, but a space where emotions could move without breaking. The path seemed shorter than before, and each step felt more grounded, as though the turmoil of recent days had carved out a steadier foundation beneath them. At the cabin, Ranger walked inside without waiting for permission, choosing a familiar spot near the stove and lowering himself slowly yet confidently. David stood for a moment, unsure whether the relief he felt came from Ranger's return or from acknowledging how much that return meant. He brewed coffee and sat near the window while Ranger rested, their proximity carrying more comfort than words. Snow began falling in soft, steady flakes, and David felt pulled toward the porch as if the air outside held answers he did not yet fully understand. Ranger joined him after a moment, breathing calmly, gaze following the snowfall. David reached into his coat and removed the folded letter he had carried for days. This time, his hands did not shake. He opened it once more, reading the words slowly, and then he set the letter down on the porch railing rather than stuffing it into his pocket as he had before. The impulse to hide from connection faded, replaced by a growing desire to engage with life instead of turning away from it. Ranger shifted closer, sensing the release of tension even though he could not know its cause, and David placed a hand near him, not touching, simply acknowledging companionship. The quiet deepened, but it no longer pressed against David's ribcage. Instead, it felt like air after a long dive, a space that welcomed breath rather than stole it. When footsteps approached from the path, David remained seated. A man from the Ramirez family appeared, carrying a small parcel and expressing his gratitude for the rescue of his daughter. His voice shook as he spoke, not with sorrow, but with relief, and his words felt like light after too much darkness. He did not stay long, and David did not expect him to, but the brief exchange left warmth behind, not heaviness. After the man left, David sat in thought, letting the world move around him without forcing himself to retreat. Ranger remained still by his side, breathing steadily, eyes tracing the snowfall as if reading messages in each flake. David spoke quietly, acknowledging that he could no longer pretend solitude kept him safe. Ranger responded with a soft exhale that felt like agreement, not obedience. As afternoon light faded into the muted glow of evening, David gathered small pieces of wood and lit a fire in the stove, and Ranger settled closer to the warmth. The flames crackled with gentle insistence, and David watched them without flinching, recognizing that fire could destroy but could also restore. The letter remained on the porch railing untouched by snow, and David felt no urgency to move it. It was enough that he no longer feared what it held. Ranger raised his head suddenly, listening to something distant, but instead of the tension that had marked previous days, he relaxed within seconds, as though whatever once lingered beyond the trees had released its hold. David understood the significance of that moment without asking for details, sensing that both of them had come through something they could not fully name, yet could finally leave behind. He whispered that they were home, not meaning the cabin alone, but the world they inhabited together, shaped by loyalty, resilience, and choices made without fear. Ranger settled again, breathing with steady confidence. David closed his eyes briefly and allowed the quiet to rest within him instead of resisting it. Outside, snow continued to fall, not as a veil hiding the world, but as a blanket, allowing it to rest. And for the first time since arriving in Spokane, David felt the silence fill, not with memories of what he had lost, but with the presence of what he still had, and what he was no longer afraid to keep. Sometimes the greatest miracles from God don't arrive with thunder or lightning. They appear quietly, in loyalty that refuses to leave, in second chances we didn't expect, in the courage to keep loving even after we've been hurt. David thought silence would save him, but God sent a loyal companion to remind him that healing often walks into our lives when we stop closing every door. And maybe you, watching this right now, have your own Ranger, a person, a memory, a moment, placed in your path not by chance, but because God knew your heart needed it before you did. So as you go back to your daily life, your work, your worries, your hopes, remember that even the smallest gestures of love can be holy. Hold the people you care about close. Forgive when you can, and leave one light on for grace to find its way in. If this story touched your heart, please share it, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so more people can feel the quiet miracles that still happen in this world. May God bless you, protect your home, and place the right souls beside you in every season of your life. Amen.